Welcome to the Big Picture Revealed show. This is with Michael O'Connor, the holistic astrologer for the Extraordinary Healing Arts Academy, and your host, Tyhson Banighen of the Wellness Show. And the topic today is paradigms, perceptions, and subjectivity. So looking forward to this show. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Tyhson. Yes, this exciting title really does a good job of encompassing a lot of what the Big Picture Revealed is about. The entire show is meant to incorporate the reality that whatever we deem truth, whatever we measure as fact, etc., is linked to our perceptions, and invariably, since you can't take the observer out of the experiment, whoever's involved invariably is involved according to their beliefs, their paradigm, their conditioning. Thinking otherwise is just a grand illusion. I say this now because as an astrologer, it's always been my interest to understand why and how it works. And that's a big motivation behind this entire series, this show. It works because when we get into this notion of subjectivity, we can understand from a holistic perspective, or from the spiritual notion of it's all one. There's a grand continuum. All of these phrases, oneness, the great continuum, holism, it's an understanding that the entire scope of existence, that would be the universe, that would include all dimensions really in its encompass, which is a grand statement, I appreciate. But ultimately, as has been said many times, it's all one. It's all one grand continuum. In other words, it's all subjective. If it was, when we know the notion of oneness means it's like a communion, a grand, just those words do enough. So when we understand the subjectivity of existence, when we acknowledge that our perceptions are, any conclusions we draw are subjective, then we enter into, ironically speaking, that is what is the very thing that increases our objectivity. So it's a bit of a riddle. And I say this because, you see, Western science, or the mainstream scientific model, which is anchored in materialism, has traditionally endeavored to achieve pure objectivity. That was its mandate. It couldn't, it failed, but when it did, it went quiet. Oh, oops, that's not the answer we wanted. And even a few years ago, we're hearing a lot about the Higgs boson. Oh, they've got to the next level of to the bottom of all of existence, where they were going to prove that matter, which is another way of saying chemistry and biology, is the source of existence. The material realm is true. No, it all went quiet. It's kind of a type of hypocrisy, a bit of a snow job. It's a bit of a hypocrisy. It's not to say that the scientists aren't sincere. It doesn't mean that the experiments aren't profound. It just means that they're kind of barking up the wrong tree. Rather than honor that there's a whole realm of different realities in existence, metaphysics, astrology, and all of those sort of alternative pseudo-science, they refer to them kind of from this sort of hubris position, kind of a proud, somewhat arrogant attitude of, oh, that's just pseudoscience. And we're busy proving pure objectivity. Well, they can't. Because the truth of the matter is that existence is subjective. when you get into that word subjective, if you really get deeply into it, you're going to get in touch with what would be a source of existence, a God force, if you like. I don't blame the, various factions of society for dismissing religion because it gets very fanatical and feverish and belief oriented and credulous. And those are factors that, very religious people, that you might think they don't understand those words. They're so locked in their subjective paradigms. That's a slightly different perspective now. When we say subjectivity, it's a different statement than one's subjective paradigm. So objectivity is a recognition that our apparent viewpoint on things as absolute is not. As soon as we recognize that it's based on a paradigm. So for example, the Higgs boson in Western science, for example, the God particle, they called it, the ultimate minutiae, the smallest particle in existence that is the brainchild of all of existence. We would all know about it. It would be global knowledge. They'd be trumpeting it off the rooftops. It would be just a given right now, but it's not. They can't do that because their whole endeavor was based on the paradigm of materialism. So you see, it's always, basically speaking, bias, which is linked to advantage. We can talk about bias and prejudice, but we can get really close to advantage. It's to the advantage of those perpetuating that perspective that existence is ultimately materialistic. There are various forces in the world, in society, in the world, that must be deeply invested in this. There's no other way. They're not deeply invested in truth, I would encourage, because they're dismissive of a full wide range of realities. So when you understand that, you think, well, why are you so dismissive? Why is your perception so selective? And the answer is because they've been brought up under the conviction that their paradigm is absolute, which is another way of saying we are fundamentalists. We dismissed fundamentalist religion so we can replace it with fundamentalist science. That's all that we have. That's what we're dealing with in the world right now. A fundamentalism of one form or another. So when we get into a deeper understanding of appreciating the word paradigm and perception and subjectivity, we actually enter into as much of an objective type of conversation as we can. We're at least in the arena of the riddle remains that we're in the arena of making use of our objective mode of thinking or objective perceptions, which are invariably, when they're in full force, when our objectivity is in full force, it must concede that it is linked to a paradigm and is invariably not absolute. That's as simple as it gets. There is no final paradigm, no final system, no final measurement, no final means of deriving a purely objective perspective. It's, even as I speak here right now, of course, my perspective is actually rather objective on the fact that I am and everybody else is perceiving and interpreting according to their paradigm. And only when you acknowledge that, when your objectivity acknowledges the ultimate subjectivity of things, are you in a more objective position. Because then you recognize that from your objective standpoint, there must be a whole spectrum of versions of interpretation of reality, right? We end up
Absolutely.
we end up in a spectrum of, oh, you might say, oh, from the perspective of physics, you've come up with these hard facts. Bravo. From the perspective of metaphysics, you've come up with these understandings and methods. Bravo. From the standpoint of what can be described as a mysticism, you've come up with these experiences. Bravo. If you come from a place of a certain school of philosophy, wow, you really coined it. You really captured the essence of that philosophy. Bravo. Right? So, but we recognize there that one does not cancel out the other. As soon as we do, we've actually stepped into a model of assumption of objectivity, dismissing that it is limited, and we can only uphold that position in the final analysis, either with belligerence, control, or violence. It's basically as simple as that. All fundamentalism can only be perpetuated as a kind of belligerence, which is like those adherents to it have an inability or an unwillingness to see it another way. That's their belligerence. Control would be kind of like some form of external control in any, like whether it's governmental, basically governmental, political is mostly what I'm talking about, because we're talking about a mass of humanity, big, large groups of people. Okay, so control. Control can get very nasty and it can turn into violence. In other words, you will yield to our control or we will hurt you. Basically, that's exactly, unfortunately and sadly, where humanity is headed from the standpoint of certain modes of endeavor that present themselves as seeking the truth. If we acknowledge that we live in a subjective universe, we immediately open our minds to other versions of truth. It's the only sane humanistic understanding. It's the truth. It is the truth, but it's a truth that's humble to the acceptance that its truth is not fundamentally and absolutely the only truth. It's a, you know, I'm sure it's been said before, but it's just a celebration of those things. And it's once we understand that basic principle, now we're in an arena of discussion, and it becomes an arena of a celebration of human thought and endeavor, a celebration of the various, or call them the variables, the various modes of expression. If that type of attitude, of that understanding were strongly presented across the world in our school systems, the understanding of ultimate subjectivity, which is purely, it's not something you have to prove in a lab. You know, it's not something one has to go on and on to demonstrate. It's very self-evident. It's around, like there's, you know, whether you want to go imperial measuring system versus metric, for example, why couldn't there be others, right? Like you can measure something in a variety of ways, which is, you know, just by, you know, which one is the measurement? It's kind of silly, isn't it? Do we put it as 32 centimeters, or do we call it more to the tune of 12 inches or something? you know. Is it matter? But this is it's a type of reductionism. People, scientists who are very into reductionism are very proud of their reductionism. You know, it's like a type of cerebral grinder. Let's grind everything down. It's like the Humpty Dumpty poem. If once you take Humpty Dumpty apart, you can't put them back together again. It's the essence, like dissection or reductionism, is a kind of a mind thing, because if you dissect the bunny, you can't have the bunny back. There's something that happened. You can't see it as an assembly of parts, because if it was, you would be able to put it back together. You know, but you can't. Something's happened if you take if you dissect the thing, right? And so on. So I say it just like that. That's the basic story. It's the understanding of that the universe is ultimately subjective, but that we've arrived at this understanding from an endeavor to assert pure objectivity and have in effect failed is that's the greatest achievement. That's philosophically, that's the greatest achievement of science to date. It's its greatest achievement. It's the very ironic thing. It proved it was wrong. It's like, that should be celebrated, right? It should be celebrated. So we can, this way, in celebrating that, we place science where it belongs, at the agreed, at various degrees of agreed use. You know, like, in other words, we employ whatever the various expressions of science is from the standpoint of our humanity. That's what it's all about. That's the whole thing right there. But if we don't do that, if we don't recognize and acknowledge the ultimate subjectivity of things, then we continue to kind of enter into a mode of deception, a mode of camouflage, a mode of kind of corruption. It's like, we're going to pull one over on you. We're going to do this anyway. It's a kind of like, it's a form of, well, whatever you want to call it. Ultimately, spiritually, it would be massive immaturity. It's an extremely covert, hidden, exclusive subjectivity, which only wants to perpetuate its agenda according to its, advantage. That's where it becomes really important to understand how dangerous the notion of pure objectivity is. It becomes the most final fundamentalism. It's where, it's what would justify genocide. It's soulless. There's no soul in it. It's only control.
Yeah, they're taking apart things into their, taking things apart into their constituent parts, like you said. It's like Humpty Dumpty falling off the wall. The parts are not the whole, never could be, and never will be, by the process of taking it apart.
Yeah.
I think for many scientists, though, and I guess that's the problem with the paradigm, and why, the book was written, that the paradigms come and go through revolution. They don't come and go easily. There literally needs to be a revolt in consciousness, because the paradigm becomes so tightly bound by its own belief system. It's like they have moral, social, political, scientific blinders on that disallows them to see anything other than the truth that they need or feel they need to protect. So, the science of revolution it's just that. It's a revolution from one paradigm to another paradigm to another paradigm. And, we'll never cease from exploration. It will continue on to be that way if we think that we have to have a paradigm. Because as you said, it's only a point of view. It's only an exclusion of other points of view. And when you get to subjectivity and all points of view are valid, then we can have an honest discussion. And we can actually share our paradigms.
Yes, it's the paradigm is an inevitability of existence, even like whether we call it beliefs or various social cultural conditioning, which are themselves anchored in other historical traditional perspectives. Say you were to go to India or China, countries with a lot of people and very old traditions, you realize that even though we can generally refer to them as Chinese or Indians, there's not a consensus on their various worldviews. There's pockets and groups of cultural influence, whether they're, again, religious or they've been influenced by geography or what other social conditioning factors. Yeah, it opens up that world to understand that there is just a form of bias, but it doesn't mean it's not celebrated. It's like the joy of going to various places, like big cities, where you can, over the course of a month, let's say, if you are really eager and keen, you can have your 3 meals a day from 90 countries. And that's rather wonderful. It's a real freedom. It's a celebration. It's abundance. So we live really in abundance that way. Our abundance is the celebration of respective subjectivity. The rest, the narrow driving force of the notion of objectivity, which has already been pretty much overthrown by Einstein. Now, admittedly, again, the scientists did not like that answer, so they kept going. That you can't take the observer out of the experiment. Oh, it's like saying with the mainstream scientific model, oh, we don't like quantum physics. We don't like that paradox word. We don't like. There's a lot of things we don't like. Oh, okay. Well, you don't like. It's like saying you don't like beets on your plate. It's like you're like a little baby. It's like a little child. Oh, I don't like pickles. Oh, okay. You don't like that. I see. You don't want to eat that. You're kind of with your two hands, with your knife and fork gripped on the table, deciding that you're actually a little tyrant. It's tyrannical. There's no doubt about it. I actually am I'm a Western astrologer, but I study Vedic astrology, Mayan astrology, Chinese astrology. I'm a celebrator of systems of astrology, and that's true of numerology and other systems yet. And one could be a celebrator of languages. One could be a celebrator of various forms like cuisine, international cuisine. One could celebrate various forms of religion or shamanism or various forms of even how to build a bridge, if you like. I'm sure that the bridge builders know, there's about 80 different ways to build a good bridge and perhaps more. And we're still coming up with new ideas. And it's like, yes, that's what we all want to hear, right? There's nothing to be afraid of. It's a wonderful celebration of variety and possibility. So behind the thrust of a worldview that must assert a position like belligerently, it has to be control, agenda. There must be something in there that is attached for reasons other than what would be called truth. It must be monopoly. That's got to be that. It's when you get really close to it, monopoly Well, I don't know. Maybe it sounds a little grandiose, but and sorry to be judgmental, but it's kind of pathetic. Unless when you get right down to it, it's like in the movies, it's like a mad scientist. I'll control the world. It has to come from a place of fear, control, ego. It has to be anchored. It must, somehow. Now, okay, maybe there's maybe it got complex along the way. Anybody who's really paying attention to what's going on in the deeper structures of power in the world know that there's a lot of secret societies. There's a lot of elitist groups, that the government that we vote in and out is not the final rung of power at all. In some respects, some would say it's rather low on the totem pole. The money behind that, and so on and so forth, and you start to follow that train of thought, you begin to go, okay, now we're getting into a network. And and it may well be that it's not merely a network of a particular nationality or something. It starts to become something else, a syndicate, perhaps it could be called. So somewhere behind our apparently otherwise objective school system, like this is just a open thought universities, you think, not really. For example, like I said this a few times, I'm pretty excited about what's called the electric universe model. For among reasons, at least it's a new model of the universe, basically, which describes the universe as electrical, and what appears to be empty space is actually what they call plasma, which is a conductor for electricity. So the whole manifest universe is like full of galaxies, is interconnected by electricity. It's like one big grand thing. Now, interestingly enough, that model dismisses the mainstream model of, let's say, how and why gravity works, which has become the Newtonian Einsteinian model. Right. Okay. They challenge that so much so that, and they can prove what they're saying with experiment. Okay. So much so that all of the tenets of mainstream science, from the Big Bang to black holes to wormholes to gravity, and the list goes on 4 and 5 times as long as that, they refer to it as pseudoscience. They're saying that it's basically all theory. It's all been made up. These are scientists who are presenting a new paradigm, and they're presenting that a lot of the mainstream model of science is based on theory that's presented as fact, and they're referring to as pseudoscience because it's not based on observation. It doesn't stand up to, according to them, various experimentation. So we're really in a funny time. It's very exciting, positively speaking, because as an astrologer and anybody else who's into metaphysics, it's sort of dismissed as, oh, that's pseudoscience. And it's very elitist, so it's all puffed up. And no, we don't study that nonsense. We're scientists. Like that's not science, actually. That's something else. That's called bias. That's called prejudice. That's called fundamentalism. You don't study things but that's what science is supposed to do, right? It's supposed to study things. So it doesn't. So when this understanding, therefore, we're immediately in a position of recognition. It's very evident. It doesn't take a lot of research and thought and endless investigation to come to the realization that there's various paradigms like the Western scientific materialistic model that's presented as the truth. Its initial objective in its early days was to demonstrate through experiment facts, factual, measurable, phenomenal realities that were otherwise dismissed by an excessively dogmatic church. That's what it all started with, a revolution against the church, right? Okay, which is great and fine. But it progressively moved beyond its interest in fact, which led to, by the way, the scientific revolution led to the industrial revolution. So it became very proud of itself, very wealthy, and for good reason, for darn good reason, that it's changed the world, no question, in many ways, in a very good way. So we can really celebrate that. But it sort of gently started moving into the position of, we're now the holders of the truth. That's what happened, you know, in a nutshell. Now we're the Pope, if you like. We're the truth. Now, oh, where did that start coming in, right? We're the truth, and the truth is provable by mathematics, and the mathematics is the language of our truth, etc. But the new scientists coming in who are challenging this model, they refer to the mathematics of the mainstream model as mathemagics. They go, oh, so you're telling me that because you've proven it on the chalkboard with chalk, that's a fact. They're like, no, that's not a fact. That's the new breed of this scientific revolution are saying that's theory. And it works on chalkboard or on paper, but it doesn't work in fact. So we're really in an interesting place. I want to add just another little piece, though. The thrust of this position of science is such that it has got a lot of momentum. So you see, you have this notion of truth of that is we're now like, it's just a materialistic universe. If you're nothing but if you're not an atheist, you're an idiot. That's, by the way, you're an idiot if you're not an atheist. An atheist knows the truth that we're material beings made by biochemistry. It's all random. It doesn't really mean anything. It's just, you know, whatever. You don't get it. And we're the upholder. That's the position of truth that they hold. Now, what that does is it allows for a whole massive surge of various forms of technology, which people would otherwise object to, but it's forced upon them, in effect. It's not a political process. It's not a democratic process. In particular, it's not a democratic process. It's more of it's enforced by actually the marketplace, just like the new fifth generation. It's not an agreement among people in the country. It's actually being pushed by more economic forces than political, right? So that's the thing where we're at. So you have this fuzzy kind of notion of truth that's supported by a lot of power. So in other words, the power that's upholding that truth is not interested in the truth. They're only interested in the power. It's very evident. Only interested in the power of whatever their monopoly is, whatever their objective is, whatever the invariably the agenda is. They just want the power to go ahead with their designs and I'm not saying there's no valid reason in the larger scheme of things. I'm not here to say it shouldn't exist, but I think it's just important for us to be aware that it's operating in a fundamentalist mode, interestingly enough, and it has enough power to plow through opposition and be dismissive. But if it was interested in truth, it wouldn't do that. It wouldn't do that.
Now, this is a very interesting discussion, because you're talking about truth, but what you're really saying is that as soon as you try and nail down truth, or come to the ultimate truth, or boil it down to the truth, or whatever the words you want to use, you've already closed the door on truth itself. That truth is an ongoing discovery, an ongoing exploration. There's no end point to it, and it has to allow other points of view to coexist at the same time. So truth is not really what we think it is. It's something that, oh, we found the truth, there, we're done, we're finished, we can hang it on the wall, point at and say that's the truth.
Yeah, that's it.
Is that what you're getting at?
It's the yes, this type of thinking, in as positive way as it can be said, supports a social and what might invariably prove to be a political dialogue, but it's a social dialogue where it erodes staunch fundamentalism. That's the beauty of it. It challenges staunch fundamentalism, and it does so by a position of a celebration of subjectivity. So it challenges all of those asserting a position of pure objectivity or fundamentalism to yield. They have to yield. They cannot get away with it. You can't be Jesus or Allah or Muhammad or whatever it is that they're going to, this is the one, you know, it can't happen anymore. So that's the gift of the science. It can't, the religious fact can only do it from a belligerent point of view. So, but then they'll be rendered as belligerent, but it need not be like that. We can say, oh, well, your choice of experience of, the higher power or your conviction is surrounding the notion of Jesus. Now, of course, this sounds a little, I'm making light of the emotional fervor behind it. It's true, right? But the religions themselves, fundamentalist and fanatical as they may be sometimes, don't have market power. That's the funny thing. They might have, like the Roman Catholic Church might, but it's all kind of a land owned, like they own the land. It's like, well, what are you going to do with the land? In this day and age, it's more like information that leads to various, products, whether it's the product, the productivity, the production factory, whatever, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not a new story. Of course, this is not a new story. It's an old story. Power is linked to opportunity to perpetuate one's particular interest or agenda. The problem is that it's a destructive, if without the appreciation that there's no such thing as pure objectivity, it's all subjective, invariably it's destructive. That's the problem. It becomes destructive. It can't but be destructive because it must then, once it cannot accept that its position isn't absolute, it must turn to control. And then invariably, when that is rebelled against, it must turn to violence. We're seeing it in Gaza. Actually, it's a good example in Gaza. It's first there's this is our homeland, that's our truth. Second, we're going to control this with might. And third, if you oppose us, we will kill you. So it's like, it's fairly glaringly obvious to everybody. Everybody's like, but then we have to all suffer and watch how, various other countries and politicians kind of present themselves as being good and wise and caring, but meanwhile they're kind of having lunch with people who's in a position to enforce their position with violence, where people have died, tragically, and all of which sits on a hypocrisy. And invariably anybody who's thinking knows that, because if it was your child, my God, if it was your little pet dog, you would be on the floor bawling. These men, these leaders, if it happened to them, they would be sobbing if it was their child, right? So it's inevitably a hypocrisy. It's an old story, of course, on our planet. So you can only, in saying what I'm saying, in terms of the ultimate, that is subjectivity, and subjectivity ultimately expresses itself in various modes of expression. And by that acceptance, by that appreciation, we enter into discussion. We're now into, yes, we might get frustrated that somebody else is getting more market share. But if we go in,
Right.
if we go into that subjectivity, now we start to go into that subjectivity, start to explore it. We start to get to what could be various notions of something more, like it's one grand whole, one grand continuum, one grand oneness, if you like, one great whole of a consciousness. Now we're inevitably we're in a different paradigm. It's interesting to say that word. We're in a different mindset. We're now in a cooperative. We have to be cooperative, right? That at this point, have to be. What I mean is, here it goes. If you're true to that, if you get the subjectivity of things, you inevitably will enter into a dialogue.
And you have to embrace more and more and more. So there's no end to it. There's no end to the truth. It's always expanding. It's always including other possibilities. And so oneness, or, wholeness, takes on a whole different perspective. It's not like the final truth or objective reality. It's expanding knowingness that never ceases, because there's always another aspect to learn from. So we move from revolution, which is my opinion against yours, because you were dogmatic and I need to revolt against you because I have a better way of seeing the world or conducting the world. But then I become as dogmatic as you were in the beginning. So now I'm the problem. So it's like you said in Gaza, it comes from that whole thing of, being the victim and being the persecuted. And then now that we're not the victim, we become the persecutor. And then they force everybody else to be the enabler. Oh, well, that's all right, because, they were deprived of a homeland and this and that, or whatever the rationalization is. So we go around the mulberry bush over and over again, from the abuser to the rescuer to the persecutor, and on, and we go from revolution to another revolution, and forget that holism, like you're saying, and subjectivity has to do with the evolution of consciousness. It's a never-ending process. It's always inclusive. It's not separating out things one from the other. There's no detached observer. There's no final point. There's no stake in the ground that this is it. At least that's how I see it.
Yes, exactly. It's exactly what I'm getting at. It opens. It becomes, as you said, Tyhson. It becomes it opens the doors to exploration. It opens the doors to discussion. It opens the door to dialogue. Now, I do appreciate that you can't please all the people all the time. And when it comes to a game on the field, somebody has to win and somebody has to lose, right? And I do appreciate all of that reality of duality. It's the way it goes. Otherwise, if there wasn't that objective of winning, the game wouldn't be so fun. So we have to have that. But there comes, and and it's true that as that protracts out into larger, more serious, realities like monopoly and so forth, where it gets really big into do or die in business, well, it does get nasty, and that's why we see that in the world. But
isn't that an abstraction? Isn't the whole idea of the desire or the need to play a game is missing the whole point? That the game board itself is an illusion. It's a set of rules that you've created, and you say, come play this game, and you have to win the game this way or that way. It's all a set limit of rules to play a game, and it's all bound up with winners and losers. As soon as you step off the game board and say, I don't want to play anymore, there's no game. There's no winners and there's no losers. So I think we've caught ourselves in a pair playing the game the way we are, that we are reinforcing it in our children. We reinforcing it in our sports program. We reinforce it in our way we do business and their social actions everywhere. It's the exclusion of the other in order to succeed on my own, because the last man standing or the person with the most toys wins. So it's really counterproductive the way we've set this up. And I think it's right that we call this entertainment. Going to a football game is entertainment. That's all it is. It's like got nothing to do with reality. And neither does the game of life have really. It's just another social game that we've bought into, that this is the best game on the planet to play. I don't think so.
Exactly. I mean, there's something to be said about games, and we all tend to enjoy them, and it can become fun in all kinds of good ways. But it's like, sadly, we don't think of ourselves as a humanity with a collective shared, like, familial. This is what we're basis where we're challenged to come to the understanding that we're human beings, and we come from this planet, and it's maybe a bit of a lofty ideal for some to think that could occur, and it may be that some forces that are behind the scenes are aiming for that, and maybe they feel that whatever it takes to get it, whatever casualties might occur, it's worth it, because if we arrive at that place, then we can make that happen. But that's the key word. You can only do it from a place of making it happen. And this is where it kind of
exactly
it gets very tricky, because you begin to wonder if it's possible that we can actually enter into a time and era where we accept that the truth of the matter is that truth is ultimately subjective, and it can only be experienced and interpreted subjectively, either by individuals or groups. It's so that's a kind of a very wonderful ideal, and this entire series, The Big Picture Revealed, comes full circle to this appreciation of perception, interpretation, and behind those has to be belief paradigm. And even if you acknowledge that my belief or paradigm is loose, like I don't have I don't necessarily believe in matter at the source of existence or the Big Bang, or I don't believe in certain deities, spiritual, like avatar figures in various cultures and so on. Even if but still I have various forms of bias and conditioning that we can rather quickly begin to recognize. It's very evident. It's very evident, and it's like the reflection of an evolved mindset and culture to appreciate that for whatever reason we have our bias that we do, and then we can kind of as a humanity reckon, oh, you had those experiences, oh, you were conditioned that way, oh, you were brought up with those beliefs, and it comes back full circle, of course. What another type of discussion, well, when I say of course, what I mean is it's what we've just been said again and again. It's what we call the ego, right? Meaning, now, if you get into a holistic paradigm, a mindset of subjectivity in the universe, it brings you closer to a consideration that there's more than a merely materialistic model, and the very notion of thinking about deeper realities which stem into source of existence starts to open the doors to notions like the soul. I know that's a bit of a leap, but it opens the door. But it's the soul, it's the ego mind dismissive of the soul. That's the problem. That's my paradigm. I'm gonna, I would admit it's the appreciation that we need to be able to see what constitutes a position of ego. If we were taught that, what constitutes a position of ego versus soul? Ego.
Yeah, it's based on three lies, from my point of view.
Oh yeah.
The first lie is time, the second lie is space, and the third lie is separation. And when you have those three lies, you have the third dimension. And when you're subjective, like you said, have a subjectivity toward it, you have an infinite possibility. There's no end to the possibilities of what truth or reality or existence could be. We're already jumping to the concept of a multiverse, life and other dimensions, other possibilities. Immediately, we're not confined to the third dimension, which is in and of itself an illusion, a projection that comes from three basic principles that science itself is beginning to show us are not true. And that is that we're separate. When we're discovering we're all one. Any pursuit that you take, almost in the voyage of discovery, brings you back to yourself. It may take a long time, but that's the voyage of discovery. And so the holism is really fascinating because there's the concept itself. I mean, there's no beginning and there's no end. It's just always, you could say, expanding, more inclusive. There's no boundaries. There's no edge to it. To me, that's an exciting world that we're entering into.
Yes, exactly. Like even when you say the science itself, well, my mind rather quickly goes to, okay, there's many branches of scientific inquiry, and within the general overview or the umbrella of the term science, there's actually more than one paradigm. It's not all just agreed upon, So when we recognize that that's not just an agreed upon paradigm itself, there's debate within science. That's very, very important because I'm an audio communicator, so I really hear, the words people use. I recognize there's visual, kinesthetic, and auditory. So I'm largely auditory, and I really listen carefully to what words are used. And then because I have a philosophical bent of mind, I hear the words they use, and I question the meaning behind the word used. So that type of thinking starts to lead one to what positively would be a less assumptive mode of thinking and dialogue. You enter into an appreciation that it opens the floor to discussion. So going back to it, though, what I'm hearing you say here, what I mean by all that is that the Department of Quantum Physics, or the aspect of science in the quantum physics department, right, which is sort of the mystical branch of science, right, which
using that word and science coexisting, that's really radical.
I know. It's the mystical branch because it's nonlinear, right? It's a nonlinear model, and the scientists who are involved in it, they know that. So they are scientists by profession, by training, by title. They deem themselves that. They conduct various forms of experiment, but the experiments they conduct are largely perception experiments. If you know, they just so happen to be, and that's where I'm quite sure what emerged was what's called the quantum physics gave rise to the neuroscience. Neuroscience was now, okay, well, if that's what is happening, now we have to study the brain. We have to study how the brain works. And now I hear people who are neuroscientists coming up with our conclusions. It's like, here we go again. It's like, just because you conducted various forms of experiment, have you brought your experiment to philosophical debate? You must bring forward how you did the experiment. If you do not present how the parameters of your experiment clearly, then don't call it an experiment. I could dick my finger into water and say, I did this experiment. Well, okay, that's a nice experiment. So we don't know what you mean. So we have to hear, we kind of get mesmerized by science and experiment and the proof. It's like, this is not proof. This is called poof. It's got, hey, poof.
Yeah.
It's like, oh.
I have a fundamental problem here. Let me just see if I can articulate it, and just go back to you being a more of a rational, scientific approach to the use of words, which I greatly appreciate, because words have power and significant meaning. And when you don't use the words carefully, then you lose them trying to convey. But behind the words, if you were listening to a speech that really empowered you, you felt really good about it, and you asked that person right after the speech, what did that person say? Invariably, they wouldn't remember anything, sentences. It was really the emotional content. It was really the delivery. It was the passion. It was the moment. It was charisma. It was the energy, which was beyond the words that carried the day. So why am I saying this? Because there's two ways of knowing. There's a scientific or rational or analytical, or the weak consciousness that we have. And then there's ineffable aha, eureka, blinding flash of knowingness, intuition, holism, which comes full blown into consciousness beyond words. It has it can have an infinitude of knowledge in 1 microsecond. And this is the basis of all science. This is the basis of all discovery. This is the basis of all the movement of consciousness throughout all of history, is that flash of illumination. Call it eureka, I don't care whether you're in the bathtub or Newton have an apple dropping on his head. Whatever the circumstances, doesn't matter. It's that blinding flash of knowing. Now we spend the rest of our lives trying to explain the ineffable, the unexplainable. Now we go into words, we go into language, we go into culture, we go into science explanation, or we go into the mystical, or we try and do it from religious perspective. But it's all an artifact of the original experience, which was beyond words, and it was beyond paradigms. It was just a connection with the infinite, connection with our wholeness. And it was the breaking down those 3 illusions I talked about, which was separation and time and space. They all collapsed into that now moment, and you had this Aha. This is the dilemma that we're having here, not here in the conversation so much, but as humanity, is that we forget the source of our knowingness.
I hear all that and I appreciate that. It's when a speaker speaks and people go away not remembering it. To me, it means that they were hypnotized. Now, that does not mean that the hypnotized is another word to be careful with. And, they allowed themselves to be influenced by the sincerity, by the intelligence, by the charisma, by the quality of the delivery. They allowed that to have an effect on them, which may well prove to be very positive. And that is a very wonderful thing, but in the subjectivity model, it's qualified as my experience. So even the word knowing, that they knowing, okay, so you don't, all is what you experience, what you understand, what you perceive, what you interpret, and that has to stay alive. We must stay with that. I deduce, I rationalize, I induce, if you like, whatever my language is, whatever my model of measuring, whether I'm a very linear rationalist or whether I'm very right brain introvert, if you like, or that's not quite the right word, very emotional intelligence, if you like. There's different ways of describing the mind this way. You enter into a qualification of your experience, and of course it's idealistic, but in an ideal world we'd be celebrating one another's experience as good for you. We'd be kind of like, awesome.
Yeah, well done.
Right, we'd be like, wow. And if it could have an effect beyond, like you're suggesting, like if that, let's call it a euphoria, for lack of better words. And I don't mean to say it, and I mean that in a good way. That wow, there's like I went to a show. It was wow, right? I'm moved. I'm changed. Maybe in a certain kind of way, I'm transformed. Okay, people will, as the saying goes, and I feel healed. I feel like it opened something up. Well, hallelujah, right? It's an hallelujah moment for them. And if we're in our humanity, we're having an hallelujah moment, both for them and from them, in a varying respect. So it's a very lofty kind of thinking for some, especially in marketplace competition, very winner loser, black white world. It starts to get a little bit soft and fuzzy for some. If they didn't go away winning, but that's where, if we were, and it's growing out there, we can go, oh, that's you have like a really big ego. Oh, that's really obvious. Like, you can't empathize at all with anybody else's experience but your own, and you must go away being the final winner, right? That's the attitude. So, it's really evident to us all, you have this really big ego. And we can see that. And now people, unfortunately, we're living in this time and age where the general level of knowledge has gone up quite a bit in the past 25 years because of the internet, where there's a rich exchange of information from the most superficial but to very rich levels. And people are really thinking, and it's an open arena of thought. So now most people, even though they don't maybe in a high level of psychology understand the term ego, they get it. Yeah, they get that. If we were without going on and on, I'll just this whole discussion today, the paradigm perception and subjectivity is a celebration of the inevitable subjectivity of our experiences and our interpretations, and it kind of encompasses everything in the big picture, from the standpoint that when we bring it full circle, we realize that we have a capacity to perceive and to interpret, but it's based on beliefs and paradigms. So as long as that remains an operative it's fairly self-evident, because most people recognize now beliefs and conditioning, those two words. Once that's acknowledged, we enter into a social dialogue, and we start to celebrate more and more one another's point of view, and it humbles us. It actually liberates us from the need to have the final word. I was watching on a Facebook thread the other day, this woman who's quite bright and she's charismatic, and she was saying, something about, we need to stop letting these dumb people get so much attention. And I said to them, well, maybe there's clever people behind them that like working with these so-called dumb people because they're easier to direct. And besides, at what point do we step in and how do we censor who's dumb? Like when does that, so I thought, so it was just and she got kind of into a little bit of word magic, I thought, to kind of try and get out of that. It's become, in other words, what I heard her saying in a nutshell was, oh, you're jealous. They're getting attention. You feel you should be getting attention, and I don't doubt you merit attention, but you're not getting it, and it feels frustrating for you. That kind of stuff, right? You can quickly unravel things, and so that's the whole story. It's just that the big picture, but the kernel of this, really, though, the real essence of everything I just that I'm interested in sharing with this is that we have a consciousness that produces perception. So in that respect, yes, I'm transparent about that. My paradigm is linked to that. Consciousness precedes matter, and we talked about that. This is what has been said throughout this series along the way. Consciousness precedes matter. Consciousness preceding matter invariably brings us in touch with a holism within existence, and invariably it, by its very reality, implies a communion. It's invariably spiritual, but it's not religious. And I don't mean to insult anybody who has strong convictions religiously, and I celebrate that. But I also recognize its limitation as their interpretation, and I wouldn't want to take that from them, but I don't want to be forced into it. That's all. I want to celebrate your euphoria, your conviction, and kudos on you, and so on. But I can see it as a version of the story. But so it's in essence what people say, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. And they don't go on to say what that means. And I'm not saying they should, but what I'm saying is what they, I think, mean is they recognize that they're a part of the communion. They're a part of the oneness. They're a part of they're humble in their recognition of their experience being what it is as their own, good or bad, or somewhere in between, and they see it in others, and they then endeavor to find ways to engage with others in various modes, but they're not trying to convert the others, and neither are they trying to deceive the other. It's those two. The conversion is very transparent. We're just going to convert you because you don't get it. The first rule of semantics is there's no it. So that's all gone. And secondly, there's no, if they're not transparent, then what they're doing is it's trickery. because they're trying to trick you. There's a trickery. There's some kind of deception. There's some kind of game. There's some kind of manipulation. There's something going on. If there's a sort of an attachment that they're trying to convert you or something, they're trying to bend you. And I've experienced this quite a bit with, like even as an astrologer, as a Western astrologer, from various branches of astrology who, kind of go, oh, that's not the real astrology and this and that. So this is what pushed me along in this way of thinking. So, on the high side of it, being challenged by people who have objected. And I just thought to myself, wow, they really are, they have no idea what they're talking about. They're coming from a belief. They were easily sold. One guy, I always remember this, I read a book. That one always got me. And I thought, wow, amazing how easily led people can be away from things. So I study various systems of astrology like I do, like Person-Mite languages that I mentioned earlier, as seeing each as having its own essential quality and style, but none being absolute. And in the final analysis, how one brings forward that body of knowledge with another, like as an astrologer, bringing interpretation, insight, guidance, etc. You're never in a position of assuming that you're in an absolute position. And that's the beauty of it. You're never...
Isn't that the beauty of one station? And we're just over the hour now. And but paradigms, perception, and subjectivity, it's exciting. It's also the door to infinite possibilities for discovery, inclusion, enjoying other people's points of view. Yeah, I like it. It's a great understanding of how we've got ourselves entrapped in trying to be objective or be a detached observer, or to deny our emotions, or to feel that we have the truth, or that we need to explain the truth to somebody, or that we need to save them, or whatever the variations on that theme. So I thank you for opening the door to a larger world, a more inclusive world, a better way in which we can learn to play cooperatively rather than competitively, and that we can get as much joy out of doing that as being hurt by somebody else being the big loser. So these are really interesting concepts, and thank you very much for sharing. And I really enjoyed the discussion today in the show. So thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everybody. And thanks for joining in with this series. We're going to actually present this series. I just want to remind listeners before we go, Tyhson, that this series will be for sale soon. For those of you who have followed along, or, in the course of time, it will be presented both in audio and literary in a book form. So it'll be something to look forward to receiving and studying, because the goal of this knowledge is not to show you a big picture so you can believe in it. It's to give you knowledge that is in effect axiomatic. It's knowledge that makes you think in such a manner where there's no believing required, only thinking in a way that's not trying to defend a particular position. And that's the gift of it. So thank you very much for all that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael.
Okay. Bye.
The Big Picture Revealed show is sponsored by the Extraordinary Healing Arts Academy, hosted by Facebook Live on the Extraordinary Healing Arts Academy Facebook page, produced by The Wellness Show, www.thewellnessshow.ca, and stay tuned, same place, same time. See you next week. Bye for now.